In the twilight of her reign, the once mighty Queen Elizabeth I began to fade, both in body and in spirit. The woman who had defied kings, commanded armies, and inspired a cultural renaissance was now facing the one enemy she could not outwit: time itself. By the year 1602, the Queen's health had begun to deteriorate rapidly. She was approaching her 70th year, an extraordinary age for a Tudor monarch, but her body bore the marks of a lifetime of stress, grief, and the heavy burden of rule. Her courtiers whispered that she was growing weaker, and even the walls of her palaces seemed to echo her decline. The golden glow that had once surrounded her name was dimming into a shadow of exhaustion. Elizabeth had been known for her vitality, her keen intelligence, and her commanding presence. She had survived plots, wars, and betrayals, always emerging untouchable, as if guided by destiny. But now, her iron will was being eroded by the creeping weight of age. The Queen's beauty, once legendary across Europe, had long been sustained by artifice-powdered lead makeup to hide blemishes, elaborate wigs to cover thinning hair, and costly gowns that masked her frail frame. Beneath the surface of glamour, her health was collapsing. Her teeth were decayed and blackened, causing constant agony when she spoke or ate. The lead in her cosmetics, used daily for decades, had poisoned her slowly, contributing to headaches, muscle weakness, and possibly even memory lapses. Her joints ached, her feet were swollen, and she struggled to walk without pain. Courtiers noticed how she leaned more heavily on her attendants, her once quick stride replaced by an unsteady shuffle. Yet she refused to admit weakness. Pride had always been her armor. The Queen would rather die on her feet than be seen as frail. In the final months of 1602, her mood grew dark and unpredictable. The spark that had once lit her eyes was fading, replaced by a haunted, vacant stare. Those closest to her described her as deeply melancholic, a word used in Tudor times for what we might call depression. Her laughter, once booming across the halls of Whitehall, vanished entirely. Meals went untouched. Music, once her great pleasure, fell silent. She shut herself away from her courtiers, preferring solitude over ceremony. Some said she was mourning her lost youth. Others believed she was tormented by guilt over the people she had condemned. Elizabeth's rule had demanded sacrifice, and though she never married or bore children, she had given herself entirely to her crown. But now the crown itself seemed to weigh heavier than ever. The winter of 1602 was harsh, and the Queen's health suffered further in the damp cold of her palaces. The physicians of the day, armed with little more than superstition and leeches, could offer no real help. They recommended poultices, herbs, and bleeding to balance the humors, but Elizabeth refused most of their treatments. She had seen too many die under their care. She trusted her instincts more than their science. Her ladies-in-waiting reported that she spent long hours sitting motionless before the fire, her eyes unfocused, as though staring into a memory only she could see. Her attendants whispered among themselves, wondering if she was seeing ghosts. In a way, she was. The Queen, who had ruled England for 45 years, was haunted by the past, by those she had loved and lost. Her beloved Robert Dudley, her sweet Robin, had died years before. His absence had left an ache that never healed. The execution of Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, the man who had reminded her of Dudley in youth and spirit, left her broken. She had ordered his death for treason, but it had shattered her heart. Some said she wept for days after signing the warrant. That guilt returned to torment her in her final months. Every room in her palace seemed to hold his shadow. The once brilliant Queen, who had balanced politics and passion with perfection, was now a lonely old woman surrounded by memories. Physically, her decline was unmistakable. Her appetite vanished, and she grew dangerously thin. Her face took on a waxen pallor, her eyes sunken and rimmed with dark circles. The royal physicians observed swelling in her legs and feet, a clear sign that her heart was failing. She complained of stiffness in her limbs, of sharp pains in her chest, and of an overwhelming fatigue that left her unable to move for hours. Yet she still refused to take to her bed. To Elizabeth, lying down meant surrendering to death. She insisted on standing for long hours, leaning against cushions and the backs of chairs, her ladies begging her to rest. She would only reply, "Little must they think of me. Who wishes me to be buried before I am dead?" Her stubbornness was legendary, but now it seemed tragic. She was fighting not an enemy, but her own body. Each day became a silent battle between her will and her weakness. As her strength waned, her speech slowed, her mind clouded, and her once sharp memory faltered. Courtiers noticed she often forgot names and repeated phrases. Her attendants grew fearful to approach her, for the queen's temper, though rare in these final weeks, still flashed with the old fire. One moment she was silent and withdrawn. The next, she would strike out in sudden anger, only to sink back into despair. Outside the palace, rumors spread through London that the queen was dying. The people prayed for her recovery, yet deep down, they knew the Elizabethan age was coming to an end. Inside Richmond Palace, where she had retreated for peace, the atmosphere was heavy, as though the walls themselves were mourning. Even nature seemed to conspire in sorrow. The Thames was shrouded in mist, and the sun rarely broke through the clouds that winter. The courtiers avoided speaking openly about succession, but the question hung in the air: what would become of England when its great queen was gone? For now, all they could do was wait and watch as the woman who had been their sun slowly faded into twilight. By February 1603, Elizabeth's decline was unmistakable. Her once radiant face had lost its color. Her voice, once commanding, was faint and uncertain. She could no longer attend council meetings. The courtiers entered her chamber in silence, bowing low, for the sight of their sovereign reduced to such frailty filled them with grief. The queen who had faced down assassins and invaders now struggled to lift a cup of water to her lips. She was still Elizabeth, the proud, unyielding monarch, but her body was surrendering to the inevitable. In those last days, she seemed to live not in the present, but in the memories of her youth, revisiting moments long past. Sometimes she murmured the names of her old favorites, her lost friends, or whispered fragments of prayers. Death was approaching quietly, and though she sensed it, she would not speak its name. She simply endured, regal to the end, refusing to let go of the image she had built, a queen who would never yield, even as her body failed her. By the turn of the 17th century, Queen Elizabeth I was not only an aging monarch but a lonely soul trapped within the golden walls of her own reign. Power, once her greatest armor, had become her prison. The woman who had ruled England for nearly half a century now found herself surrounded by ghosts, not the literal kind, but the spectral memories of those she had loved and lost. Her grief was not sudden. It had been building for years, a slow erosion of her once indomitable spirit. The first blow came with the death of those closest to her heart, her trusted advisers, her beloved friends, and the courtiers who had been with her since the early days of her reign. Men like William Cecil, her wise and loyal statesman, had guided her through the storms of politics. His death in 1598 struck her deeply. She said little of it publicly, but those in her service noticed her long silences and the shadow that fell over her face whenever his name was mentioned. But none of these losses compared to the one that truly shattered her spirit: the death of Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex. Essex had been bold, handsome, and reckless, everything that reminded Elizabeth of her youth and of the man she had once loved. Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester. Essex had been like a son, a favorite, and perhaps even a reflection of the woman she used to be, daring, passionate, and proud. Yet his ambition had led him to rebellion, and his defiance forced Elizabeth into an unbearable choice. When Essex led a failed uprising against her in 1601, she had no choice but to sign his death warrant. The execution broke something inside her that never mended. Those who saw her afterward described her as haunted. She would sit alone for hours, refusing food, refusing company, whispering Essex's name under her breath. In her private chambers, she kept his ring, a token he had once given her, and it is said that she wept over it long after his death. The court noticed the change. The queen who had once danced, laughed, and flirted with courtiers now became withdrawn and silent. Her great palaces, once filled with music and life, turned cold and still. She no longer found joy in the entertainments that had once delighted her. The musicians played softly, but the queen no longer smiled. She would pace her chambers restlessly, muttering to herself, lost in thought, consumed by guilt and longing. The grief was not only emotional but physical. Her body mirrored her sorrow. Her appetite vanished, her energy drained, and her already fragile health declined even further. It was as if her heart and her body were collapsing together under the weight of years of loss. She would sit for hours, motionless, gazing at nothing, her courtiers unsure whether to approach or to leave her in her solitude. Elizabeth had always been proud of her image, the virgin queen, the immortal monarch who belonged to no man and no mortal weakness. Yet now, she seemed almost mortal, stripped of her legendary composure. Her attendants reported that she burst into tears without warning or fell into long spells of silence that no one dared interrupt. She spoke of death often, though she never directly acknowledged her own. She would say things like, "I am tired," or "I am weary of life," words that shocked those who had always known her as the woman of unbreakable will. But her will was faltering, not from cowardice, but from exhaustion, the exhaustion of a lifetime spent carrying the weight of a nation alone. She had outlived everyone who had truly understood her. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, had been executed when she was a child. Her father, Henry VIII, had left her a divided kingdom. She had risen above them all, but at what cost? Now, in her final months, Elizabeth was surrounded not by love but by duty. Her ladies-in-waiting tiptoed around her, afraid to speak too loudly or look her directly in the eye. They knew the Queen could not bear pity. She had lived her life defying vulnerability, and to be seen as weak now was unbearable. Yet even they could see the deep sadness that had consumed her. The courtiers noticed that she no longer held court as she once did. The great halls of Whitehall and Richmond were silent. The political discussions were shorter, her decisions slower. She seemed to lose interest in the affairs of the realm. Her once razor-sharp intellect dulled under the fog of sorrow. The courtiers who remembered her fiery speeches and commanding voice now heard her speak in whispers, her sentences trailing off mid-thought, her eyes unfocused. The Queen who had faced down the Spanish Armada and united her people in triumph was now fading behind the veil of her own despair. At night, her attendants said she often refused to go to bed. Instead, she sat on cushions on the floor, staring into the flickering light of candles, lost in the memories of her youth. Sometimes she spoke to empty air, as though addressing the long dead. Some whispered that she saw visions, perhaps of her mother, perhaps of Essex, perhaps of the past itself calling her home. Others dismissed it as delirium, the effect of sickness and age. But to those who loved her, it was the saddest sight imaginable. The once glorious Queen reduced to a fragile old woman haunted by memories she could not escape. Her grief also had a political cost. The court, once filled with energy and ambition, grew tense and uncertain. With no heir of her own, the question of succession loomed heavily. Yet Elizabeth refused to discuss it. She would not name her successor, perhaps out of fear that doing so would hasten her own end. So she remained silent, isolating herself even further, cutting off those who sought to comfort or advise her. Only a few were permitted near her in those final weeks, her ladies, her physicians, and the Archbishop of Canterbury, who prayed quietly by her side. Even then she rarely spoke. She communicated through gestures, a raised hand, a faint nod, a look that conveyed more than words ever could. The courtiers would later say that she seemed to exist in two worlds, one foot in the realm of the living, the other already drifting into eternity. Outside the palace, England waited in anxious stillness. The people who had known only Elizabeth as their sovereign could not imagine a world without her. Poets wrote mournful verses. Preachers spoke of her as the chosen of God. But within the walls of Richmond Palace, the Queen sat alone in the shadows, surrounded by silence. Her once brilliant mind, the guiding star of an empire, was dimming. Grief had hollowed her out from the inside. And yet, even in her sorrow, there remained something undeniably majestic, the faint glow of the monarch who had ruled with unmatched grace and power. Her loneliness was immense, her pain unbearable, but her dignity never wavered. Elizabeth I, the woman who had defied convention and conquered the world with her mind, faced her grief as she had faced everything else, in silence, with unyielding pride and utterly alone. In the final months of her life, Queen Elizabeth I seemed to drift between two worlds, one of living memory and one of shadow. Her mind, once sharp as a blade and commanding as the crown itself, began to blur with the fog of melancholy. What began as sorrow soon deepened into something darker, a quiet, creeping despair that neither prayer nor power could lift. Her courtiers had seen her angry, cunning, joyful, even cruel, but this was something else entirely. The Queen who had once commanded nations now stared into space for hours, her face pale, her lips moving silently as if in conversation with someone unseen. Some said she was haunted by guilt. Others whispered that her mind was slipping under the weight of too many ghosts. It began subtly. She withdrew from council meetings, dismissed musicians, and ordered her chambers darkened. Light seemed to irritate her. She refused company, refused food, and spoke less with each passing day. Her ladies-in-waiting often found her seated motionless in front of the fire, her eyes reflecting the flickering flames, lost in thoughts she never shared. They would whisper among themselves, wondering what she saw in those flames, the faces of the dead, the ghosts of the men she had loved and executed, or perhaps her own fading reflection. At times she would murmur the names of long-departed figures, Robert Dudley, William Cecil, her mother, Anne Boleyn. Those who listened claimed she spoke to them as though they were in the room. "Robin, you have been absent for too long absent," she was once overheard saying softly, perhaps imagining her beloved Dudley standing beside her as he had in her youth. To her attendants, this was not madness but sorrow made flesh. She was conversing with memories, trying to summon the fragments of a life slipping away. Physicians of the age, ignorant of the mind's mysteries, could offer no explanation. They spoke of an imbalance of humors, of melancholy black bile clouding her spirit. They prescribed tonics and prayers, but none of it touched the root of her suffering. Elizabeth's melancholy was not of the body alone, it was of the soul. She had ruled for 45 years, outliving rivals, suitors, and friends alike. Now, surrounded by the ghosts of her past, she found herself utterly alone at the summit of her own greatness. The courtiers who dared to see her during those days described scenes of eerie stillness. The Queen, dressed in black mourning gowns, would sit on her cushions, the golden crown of England lying untouched nearby. She no longer wore her jewels, no longer painted her face. The famous image of the Virgin Queen, white-powdered, adorned in pearls, radiant like the moon, had faded. What remained was a frail old woman, stripped of vanity, sitting in silence with the weight of an empire pressing upon her shoulders. One night, her ladies claimed to see her rise suddenly, her eyes wide and unseeing. She pointed to the shadows on the wall and whispered, "Do you not see it? The light. The light calls me." The attendants were terrified. Some thought she was delirious, others believed she was having visions of the divine. In Tudor times, hallucinations were often interpreted as spiritual signs, either angelic or demonic. For Elizabeth, who had been raised in both fear and faith, these visions may have felt like messages from beyond, a prelude to death itself. Her melancholy deepened into sleeplessness. For days she refused to lie in bed, choosing instead to rest on cushions on the floor. When her physicians begged her to take rest, she replied, "If I go to bed, I shall never rise again." Her attendants watched helplessly as exhaustion hollowed her out. She began to speak less coherently, her words trailing into whispers, her once commanding voice now trembling. Sometimes she would speak of her mother. She was innocent, she murmured once. They wronged her. At other times she would mutter about Essex, as though reliving the moment she had sealed his fate. The Queen, who had ruled by reason, was now ruled by her memories. The palace itself seemed to echo her mental decline. Richmond, once a lively royal residence, became oppressively silent. Servants moved quietly, courtiers avoided laughter. The great rooms of state were abandoned. The Queen remained in her chamber, surrounded only by her ladies and a few trusted attendants. The once bright light of the Elizabethan court, with its poets, scholars, and suitors, was extinguished. What remained was a darkened room, a dying fire, and an aging queen lost in the labyrinth of her mind. Some witnesses later described her melancholy as almost supernatural. They said she seemed to sense things before they happened, predicting storms, speaking of death when no one else dared mention it. "The wind smells of graves," she said one evening, gazing out her window. Her words chilled those who heard them, for they seemed like an omen. The Queen had always believed in signs and symbols, and now as her health failed she looked for them everywhere, in the flicker of a candle, in the creak of the floorboards, in the strange stillness of the night air. Her ladies tried to comfort her, but she resisted. When they urged her to pray, she said, "I am not afraid, but I am weary." When they told her to take medicine, she refused. "What is the need of physicians?" she asked bitterly. "They cannot mend a broken heart." Even in her despair, her pride remained. She would not allow herself to be pitied or treated as frail. But her mind was unraveling quietly, and those closest to her could see it. Toward the end, she began to fixate on death. She asked her chaplains strange questions. How long it took a soul to leave the body, whether one knew when death was near, whether the dead watched over the living. Yet she would not let them pray aloud in her presence. "I will not have them call me to my grave before my time," she snapped once, when a priest began to read the Psalms of the dying. The melancholy that had once been her private sorrow became her entire existence. She no longer signed documents, no longer gave orders. The machinery of government continued without her, but the queen herself seemed to have withdrawn from the world. Her body remained alive, but her spirit had already begun its departure. Those who looked upon her in those final days saw a figure caught between majesty and mortality, a monarch who had ruled as a symbol of strength, now consumed by the fragility of human emotion. In the candlelit quiet of Richmond Palace, the last great Tudor queen sat surrounded by memories. The laughter of her youth, the music of her court, the faces of her lovers and enemies, all swirled around her like mist. She was not mad in the ordinary sense, but trapped in the haunting echo of her own legend. The mind that had outwitted kings was now her own prison. As one courtier later said, she died not of age nor of sickness, but of the weight of her own greatness. By the spring of 1603, Queen Elizabeth I's decline was visible to all who dared look upon her. Her body was frail, her mind weary, and her spirit trapped between the pride of a monarch and the frailty of an aging woman. The once mighty Queen of England had begun to reject everything and everyone, including the physicians who had served her for years. It was not simply stubbornness, though she had plenty of that. It was mistrust, born from experience and a lifetime of watching medicine fail those around her. In an age when physicians prescribed leeches, bleeding, and mercury as cures, Elizabeth had good reason to doubt their wisdom, but her refusal of treatment was also symbolic. For a woman who had controlled every aspect of her life, surrendering her body to others, even in illness, felt like an unbearable loss of power. Her attendants begged her to take the tonics prepared by her doctors, mixtures of herbs and oils meant to strengthen the heart and clear the lungs. But Elizabeth waved them away. "They are but toys," she said. "No physic can mend that which God has broken." Her doctors attempted to explain that she was dangerously weak, that her pulse was fading, that her swollen legs were a sign of serious disease, but she would not hear them. She had never trusted physicians. She believed more in her own will and the grace of God than in their instruments and potions. For decades, she had defied illness through sheer determination, forcing her body to obey her mind. But now, her body no longer listened. As her symptoms worsened, the palace became a place of quiet panic. The physicians huddled in the corridors, debating among themselves. Some believed she was suffering from pneumonia brought on by the cold, others that she had heart failure, and still others whispered of blood poisoning from years of lead makeup. But no one dared speak their diagnosis aloud in her presence. Elizabeth was not the kind of queen who tolerated talk of her mortality. To admit she was dying would have been, to her, a kind of betrayal. The queen was England itself, and England could not die. When her ladies tried to persuade her to rest in bed, she refused. For days she remained sitting or standing, leaning against cushions or the arm of a chair, her face pale and drawn. "Little do they think of me who wishes for me to be laid in my bed," she told them sharply. "Men have made many beds for me in this world, and I know of none I shall so willingly lie in as my grave." These words chilled those who heard them. She seemed to sense her end approaching but would not allow anyone to name it. Her defiance was her last form of control. At night, when her attendants begged her to lie down, she would shake her head and mutter, "If I rest, I shall rest forever." So she sat, night after night, in her darkened chamber at Richmond Palace, surrounded by flickering candles and the smell of burning tallow. Her ladies would kneel beside her, tears in their eyes, but she would not be moved. Sometimes she would doze briefly, her head resting on her hand, only to wake suddenly as if from a nightmare. "Do not move me," she would whisper. "I am not yet ready." It was as though she feared that sleep itself would betray her to death. Her refusal of medical treatment frustrated her doctors, but none dared contradict her directly. This was the same woman who had stared down ambassadors, outwitted kings, and survived assassination plots. Even in weakness, her authority was absolute. Her chief physician, Dr. Perry, tried gently to reason with her, reminding her of her duty to her people, who prayed daily for her recovery. But Elizabeth merely gave him a faint smile and said, "Must I live for them still? I have given them all I had." These words revealed a profound exhaustion, not just of body but of soul. Her attendants began to notice strange patterns in her behavior. She refused not only medicine but food. Trays of broth, fruit, and wine went untouched. It was as if she had chosen to let nature take its course, to allow her body to fade in its own time. When urged to eat, she replied, "I am past earthly delights." Sometimes she would take a sip of water, then lapse into silence again. Her body was wasting away, but her eyes still held that unmistakable Tudor fire, a flicker of the will that had once ruled half the world. Outside her chamber, courtiers whispered that the queen had fallen into religious despair. Some claimed she feared damnation for Essex's execution. Others said she believed God was calling her home. Whatever her thoughts, she spoke little of them. Her silence was deeper than any prayer. The Archbishop of Canterbury, John Whitgift, came to her bedside to offer comfort. He urged her to place her faith in God's mercy, but she gave no answer. He asked if she still believed in Christ's salvation. After a long pause, she nodded once, almost imperceptibly. It was the only confession she would make. The Queen's decline continued steadily. The doctors could do nothing. They applied poultices to her swollen legs, burned sweet herbs to purify the air, and sprinkled vinegar to mask the smell of sickness. Nothing worked. Her breath grew shallow, her skin cold. The courtiers were told to prepare for the inevitable, though none dared say it aloud. Elizabeth still ruled from her chair, giving faint commands, her voice reduced to a whisper. Her ladies recorded her final words to them. "I am tied with a chain of iron about my neck. I am weary of life." Even as her strength failed, she refused the final rituals of death. When her attendants brought her a soft bed and begged her to lie upon it, she resisted one last time. It took hours of gentle pleading before she finally allowed herself to be lowered. "There," she said faintly. "Now all is done. I am settled." It was the closest she came to surrender. In those final hours, her chamber was silent, except for the sound of her labored breathing and the low murmurs of prayer. Her physicians stood helplessly, their bottles and powders forgotten. The Queen had denied them all, choosing to die as she had lived, by her own command. There was dignity in it, even a strange beauty. She had been England's sovereign for 45 years, and she would not let death dictate her final act. By the night of March 23, 1603, she was barely conscious. Her lips moved faintly, as though reciting a prayer. When asked whom she wished to succeed her, she made a simple gesture, lifting her hand toward the north, toward Scotland, where James VI, the son of her cousin Mary, waited. Then, in the early hours of March 24th, Elizabeth I's long struggle ended. She slipped quietly into death, her body finally surrendering to the peace her mind had denied for so long. The final days of Queen Elizabeth I unfolded at Richmond Palace, a grand yet somber residence resting along the banks of the River Thames. It was a fitting place for the end of her reign, peaceful, secluded, and removed from the political intrigues of London. By March 1603, the once glorious monarch had grown so weak that even her most loyal attendants could see that the end was near. The Queen who had once defied kings and crushed empires now sat in near silence, wrapped in heavy robes to keep away the chill, her body frail and thin, her breath shallow. The courtiers moved quietly through the palace, speaking in whispers, as if loud voices might hasten her departure. For days, Elizabeth had refused to eat or sleep. Her ladies watched helplessly as she wasted away, her once bright eyes now distant and hollow. She rarely spoke, and when she did, her words carried the weight of prophecy. "I'm tied with a chain of iron about my neck," she murmured one evening. "I am weary of life." It was not a complaint, but a confession. She had carried the burden of the English crown for 45 years through war, betrayal, and endless expectation. Now that burden had become too heavy to bear. As her strength faded, her mind seemed to exist between two worlds. She drifted in and out of consciousness, at times recalling her youth, at others speaking of those long dead. Her ladies often found her murmuring softly to herself, as if holding counsel with ghosts. Once, she whispered her mother's name, Anne Boleyn, and smiled faintly, as though seeing her again after a lifetime apart. It was a moment of strange peace amid the decay of her body. Outside her chamber, the courtiers waited for news, their faces drawn with anxiety. The kingdom had no named heir, and the question of succession weighed heavily on them all. Yet none dared press the Queen to speak of it. She was still their sovereign, and her authority, even in weakness, commanded fear and reverence. When her physicians begged her to rest, she refused, insisting on sitting upright on her cushions. "To lie down is to yield," she said, and for a time she resisted death as fiercely as she had resisted every other adversary in her long life. But the body can only fight so long against the inevitable. Her legs were swollen with fluid, her lips pale and cracked. Every breath was a struggle. Her ladies dabbed her forehead with linen soaked in rosewater, but the queen barely seemed to notice. The fire in the hearth burned low, casting long shadows across the walls of her chamber. The once splendid room that had seen banquets and laughter was now silent, but for the rustle of silk and the faint sound of her breathing. In her final night, Elizabeth's attendants gathered around her, praying softly. Among them was Archbishop Whitgift, who had served her faithfully for many years. He urged her to find comfort in God and to let her soul rest in His hands. For a long time she gave no reply. Then, with visible effort, she nodded once. It was her last act of faith. A stillness settled over the room, broken only by the muffled sobs of her ladies. The queen's breathing slowed, each breath shallower than the last. Those present later said that her face softened, that for a brief moment she appeared almost young again. Perhaps it was imagination. Or perhaps it was the final grace of a woman who had lived her entire life in the public eye, controlling even the image of her death. Shortly before dawn, Elizabeth lifted her hand slightly, as though pointing toward something unseen. Some said she gestured toward the north, signaling James VI of Scotland as her chosen successor. Others believed she was reaching for something beyond mortal sight. A moment later, her hand fell, her chest rose once more, and then she was still. The silence that followed was overwhelming. The courtiers and attendants, who had served her all their lives, stood frozen. None dared speak. The archbishop knelt and began to pray, his voice trembling. The great Tudor queen was gone. The virgin queen who had once stood invincible before her enemies, who had seen England through its golden age, had breathed her last. For a long time no one moved. Then, quietly, the Earl of Nottingham stepped forward and drew the curtains around her body. "The queen is dead," he said softly. "God save the king." Outside, the first light of dawn broke over the Thames, turning the river to gold. The news spread quickly through the palace, and within hours, the city of London was in mourning. Bells tolled across the land, their echoes carrying through mist and rain. Men and women wept openly in the streets. To them, Elizabeth had been more than a monarch. She had been the embodiment of England's strength, the mother of their nation. Now she was gone, and with her ended the great Tudor dynasty that had ruled for more than a century. In the hours that followed her death, the women of her chamber prepared her body according to custom. They washed her face, combed her hair, and dressed her in a simple white gown. A cloth of gold was draped over her, and a crown placed beside her pillow. Her body was left in state for days before being taken to Whitehall, where she lay surrounded by candles, her face calm and pale. The courtiers filed past her coffin in silence, some kneeling, others weeping. It was said that even the hardest men could not hold back their tears. For all her pride and power, Elizabeth's death revealed the humanity that had always been hidden beneath her royal image. She had been vain, fierce, clever, and proud, but also vulnerable, lonely, and deeply human. Her passing marked not only the end of her life, but the end of an era. The Elizabethan age, that glittering chapter of history filled with poets, explorers, and triumphs, closed with her final breath. Her body would soon be carried to Westminster Abbey, where it would rest beside her half-sister Mary I, uniting in death two queens who had once been divided by religion and fate. But on that quiet morning at Richmond, as the sun rose and the bells tolled, England mourned its greatest queen. Elizabeth I, the woman who had ruled with wisdom and fire, who had defied every expectation of her age, passed into legend. Her death was not just the end of a monarch, it was the closing of an age, the fading of a light that had illuminated the world.